Hey guys, it's Miss Dot. I hope everyone's having an awesome day so far. Today I'm super excited to talk about Louisiana's cultural regions. This is the fun stuff. Today you're going to be able, at the end of this video, to identify and understand the key differences between Louisiana's three cultural regions. So, yesterday we talked a lot about natural regions of Louisiana. The hills, the marshes, the terraces, the Red River Valley, and the Mississippi floodplain. And those were all natural divisions in the actual geography of Louisiana. But that's all physical geography. Today we're going to talk about human geography, about cultural differences, which don't necessarily divide along physical regions. They could just be people grouping themselves together in different places. So, a quick definition of culture. You don't need to write this down. Just keep this in mind as we go through the video. Culture is the behaviors, beliefs, values, and symbols that tie groups of people together. So again, it might not actually be physical proximity or how close you are together, but the things that you share in common, your beliefs, your values, and the behaviors that you have. Dialects, words you say, the things you wear, the food you eat, etc. So with that, let's start with our first cultural region. Region 1 is Northern Louisiana. This is Northern Louisiana. I'm lumping it Central Louisiana with it as well because they're very similar culturally. It's a rural area, which means that there's not a lot of people living there. It's not very population dense. And there's a lot of farming. So the Mississippi floodplain is fertile. The Red River Valley is very fertile. And so there's a lot of crops being grown there. It's also called sportsman's paradise. And a sportsman is someone that likes to go hunting or fishing. So it's a place where it's really good for hunting and for going outdoors and being an outdoorsy kinds of person. So there's an example of it being outdoorsy. And then here's a picture of Shreveport, which is the largest city in the north. And as you can see, Shreveport compared to our New Orleans city skyline Shreveport's a much smaller city. It's just not as many people living up in the north. All right, our second region. Now this region is super interesting. It's called Southern Louisiana. That's this big pink area right here that's called Acadiana. Now, Acadiana is another word for Cajun country or Southern Louisiana. The word Cajun comes from the word Acadian, so Acadian, Cajun. And what that means is in the early 1700s, like 300 years ago, there was a group of immigrants from France that settled up in Nova Scotia, which is in Canada, well north of the United States. And the British and the French got into a big war over trade. And the British were upset because they thought that the Acadians living in Canada, these people, were helping out the French. And so the British told the Acadians they had to leave Canada. Well, what did the Acadians do? They sailed down the Mississippi River because that was the easiest thing to do. They had their boats, and they decided to settle in southern Louisiana, and that is why it's called Acadiana. So they came around 250, 260 years ago. So one thing that happened when the Cajuns came is they started to blend their culture with the cultures that were already there. So there was an indigenous Indian culture there. There were African slaves there. And more over time, they would blend with West African slaves, and then also Spanish people, Spanish-speaking people, and people from other cultures that had moved there. And it became a big cultural melting pot. A good example of this is something called Zydeco music, which is A prime example of that cultural blending, it's French music blended with Afro-Caribbean music. And I'll play a little example for you. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this music before on the radio. Sunday morning it's on 90.7. Okay, so that's an example of Zydeco. Lots of washboard, fiddle, kind of an upbeat tune. Another thing that's interesting about southern Louisiana and also New Orleans is that there's a huge Catholic influence. So the French and the Acadians that settled there were Catholic, and they follow a Catholic calendar. So, for example, Mardi Gras is a French word meaning Fat Tuesday, which on the Catholic religious calendar is celebrated right before the 40 days of Lent. That comes before Easter. So that would be something celebrated in a French church. And they transferred that party to New Orleans and to Cajun country. Another example of the French and the Catholic influence is this fleur de lis. Here, I'll show you how to spell it. That's what it's called, fleur de lis. And it's this shape right here. Of course, you know it. It's the New Orleans Saints logo. And this is something that is, it's a symbol of the French state. So anytime you see that, it's interesting because we live in the United States, but we have this French symbol all over from the French influence that of the Acadians that moved here, and then also the French from France that lived here. So here's a bunch of interesting terms that we use a lot in New Orleans specifically. Lagniappe is one of those French words. Some of you, I know some of our students at GTA have really French last names, and that comes from being from Louisiana. So I know we have a Laurendine, a Cordier, and the French would say Cordier. They would pronounce it like that. I know there's a Baptiste. And it might be interesting for some of you with a French last name or not to research where your family came from in New Orleans. You might find some of a French influence. It could be possible that you descended from West African slaves if your family can trace it back far enough. Some of you might have come from the Caribbean, from freedmen that moved here after the Civil War. So that would be really interesting. If your family knows anything, you should ask them about that, because it would be good to know that cultural influence. Here's a picture of a plantation in southern Louisiana. And this is southern Louisiana is filled with wetlands, which we know are disappearing from our DBQ. And here is a big cypress swamp. And real quickly, we'll just go over some Cajun French, because they speak French there. Laissez les bons temps rouler, I think you know that. It means let the good times roll. Pauvre petit bête is a Cajun phrase meaning like, oh, you poor little thing. Boucherie, that's like a pig roast. And a fête dodo, that's a party that you go to. So this weekend, tell your friends, I'm going to a fête dodo. And that would be very Cajun of you. All right, our third and final cultural region is Greater New Orleans, which is one that we all know very well. It is urban, meaning it is in the city. There's jazz culture here. It's diverse. Parades. It's a cultural gumbo. It's a mixture of cultures. And it's a Creole culture. Creole meaning people that settled here from Spain and from France and that came in contact with West Africans, slaves. Here's a picture of a